I think the most important development in American politics over the last 15 or so years is that people who identify with one party, say the Democrats, absolutely have come to hate the Republican Party. And similarly, people who identify as Republicans have come to hate the Democratic Party. Now, back in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president, Democrats didn't like the Republicans, but they didn't loathe them. But today, Republicans loathe the Democratic Party and Democrats loathe the Republican Party. Just to put this into some context here, our big survey organization, the National Election Study, asks people to rate various different groups. One of them is the Democratic Party, another's the Republican Party. They ask about all sorts of groups, atheists, Christian fundamentalists, and so forth. Republicans actually view atheists more favorably than they view the Democratic Party. Similarly, the Democrats in the electorate actually have more favorable feelings towards Christian fundamentalists, which are often a group that they're at odds with on policy. So what we're talking about is just tremendously, probably unprecedentedly negative feelings that people have towards the opposite political party. The last two Congresses that have been seated, the ones that have served from 2011 through 2014, were the least successful in terms of producing legislation that we've had since we've been keeping data on these things, which that goes back to the 1940s, and it probably even goes back before that in terms of the lack of effectiveness. Now, the reason for that lack of effectiveness is because Republicans and Democrats don't necessarily have incentives to get together on things. So let's think about this. So we have Republican majorities in both the House and the Senate in this particular Congress. Now, if things get done in the government right now, who's going to get credit for that? Are the Republicans going to get credit for it, or is Barack Obama going to get credit for it? Well, in all likelihood, Barack Obama is going to get credit for it. So Republicans and Democrats have, or at least Republicans right now, don't have a lot of incentives to work with Democrats to forge compromises. So people say, oh, compromise is a good thing, but if Democrats are going to get credit for what comes out of a compromise, why would Republicans provide that? So let me give you an example of how this has kind of worked over the course of the last 6 or 7 years. So Mitch McConnell, he is the majority leader of the Senate right now. There are 54 Republicans in the Senate, and that's a pretty good job for McConnell to have. Well, let's go back to 2009. In 2009, there were only 41 Republicans. Well, what did McConnell do between 2009 and today that caused him to become majority leader? Well, he didn't give the president anything. He, in fact, famously said, my goal is to make President Obama a one-term president. Well, he didn't make him a one-term president, but what he did do is became majority leader because all of the problems that the government continued to have were blamed on the majority party. When Ronald Reagan was president, there were lots of conservative Democrats, and there were lots of Democrats who didn't loathe the Republican Party in the electorate that, they might be able to, put pressure on these conservative Democratic representatives to make compromises. So, there's this legend that Ronald Reagan used to get together and have whiskey with Tip O'Neill and, make compromises and move things forward. Well, there were incentives for Tip O'Neill to do that back then, weren't there? Because there were 40 or 50 members of his caucus that would make a deal with Reagan without him. So Tip O'Neill, the Democratic leader at the time, made the best deal that he could with the president, and things moved forward. Big tax cuts, big increases in defense spending. But there are no 40 or 50 Republicans out there for Barack Obama to work with at this point. My sense is if you dug Franklin Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson or Ronald Reagan up out of the ground and made them president, they'd have no chance in the world with this band of characters. I find it actually quite troubling. I think that there are definitely issues that if we actually came together and compromised, things would go better. So let's go back to the financial crisis of 2009. This was the worst economic calamity that we've had since the Great Depression. One would think that that would bring Republicans and Democrats together. Well, it barely did. And what we got out of this was a stimulus package that was watered down in various different ways and made it really much more difficult for the economy to recover. Now, 7 years later now, the Federal Reserve has, finally felt like we've recovered enough to nudge interest rates up just a tiny little bit. But this could have happened much more quickly. Now, did the country fall apart? Did we collapse? No, that wasn't the case. But at the same time, if we can't come together under circumstances like this, what can we come together on? You can go back to 9/11. We came together for a short period of time, but we couldn't hold ourselves together for very much longer. And I think the policy outcomes of these first years of the 21st century have been abysmal as a result. The contest boils down to me as a contest between people who are insiders and people who are outsiders. The outsiders are the Trumps and the Cruzes and the Ben Carsons and Carly Fiorina. Many of them never have held office, and in the case of Ted Cruz, who does hold office, he seems interested in blowing up, the government. On the other side, you have the more establishment figures, the Jeb Bushes and the Marco Rubios and John Kasich and folks like that. So with that in mind, what are we seeing here? Why are the outsiders so much more popular than the insiders? And I think the key to it is the just complete absence of trust that people have in the political system. Republicans these days, we asked a survey question back in 2010, and I doubt the results are very different now. We asked the classic, what we call the trust in government question. How much of the time do you trust the government in Washington to do what's right? More than 50% of Republicans in that survey said never. They could have said some of the time, and they could have said most of the time, but they said never. Now, under those circumstances, somebody who's promising to either fundamentally change, the government, or somebody who is completely outside of the government, like a Trump or a Carson, they look pretty attractive under circumstances like this. Now, it's not 100% clear that when the voting actually starts, people will follow through on these feelings. But what is clear is that those feelings are central, that anger, that frustration, that dissatisfaction with government in Washington. That's what's driving Republican voters towards these outsider candidates. And when the government actually does things well, when outcomes are clearly good, trust actually tends to go up. People get a little bit less angry. And we've seen this actually happen several times. So, oftentimes people think about Bill Clinton as the least trustworthy, slipperiest guy imaginable. Now, of course, he's been reinvented in the last 10 years or so, but when he was president in the 1990s, that's how people saw him. But trust in government went way up during the Clinton years, and it went way up during the Reagan years. What did those periods have in common? Really good government performance where the economy grew and all boats were rising during these periods. So it's possible for those things to happen. But for that to happen, government has to perform well. And there's such gridlock and such distrust and such anger and such dislike on the two different sides in Washington that it's hard for me to imagine that government's going to perform very well under those circumstances.